Welcome to the Core Insight. Today we're going to tackle something pretty intense. The recent collapse of the Assad regime in Syria began. You all sent us a ton of stuff to look at. International news, think tank reports, even some first-hand accounts. So we're going to break this all down. How did it happen so fast? Why is the whole world freaking out? And what could this mean for other conflicts, especially the war in Ukraine?
This is huge. We're talking about a dictatorship that's been around forever, seemingly unshakable for decades, and then poof, gone in a matter of days.
So okay, let's start with a timeline, just so we're all on the same page. Syria's civil war has been going on for over a decade. But this was like a sudden turn just this month, right?
Absolutely. December 7th. That's when things really started to heat up. Reports from the Institute for the Study of War started highlighting these major advances by the opposition forces, primarily a group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, and they were gaining ground like crazy. And the Syrian Arab Army, Assad's forces, they were barely putting up a fight.
So this wasn't some long, drawn-out battle, it was just like the SAA just fell apart.
A collapse of shockingly rapid collapse for a regime that's been clinging to power for so long.
So what was Assad doing during all of this? Was he like rallying his troops, giving big speeches?
Silence. Nothing. Which is the really crazy part. Well, you have this dictator known for his iron fist and suddenly nothing. No addresses to the nation, no calls to arms.
Just silence. And then just a day later on December 8th, he flees to Russia. Yep, no fanfare, no last stand, just gone.
It's an 11-day collapse of a regime that seemed invincible for years. It tells you a lot about the state of his forces, the level of opposition, and maybe even how Assad himself saw the situation.
Like he knew it was over. Maybe it's wild how fast it all happened. And while the geopolitical implications are huge, I can't stop thinking about the Syrian people. I mean, they've been through so much.
It's true. The human cost of this conflict is immense. Millions displaced, countless lives lost, and a legacy of trauma that will take generations to heal. And even now, with all this political upheaval, you have stories like the one Al Jazeera reported Syrians rushing to Saidnaya prison, desperate for any news about loved ones who vanished during the war. Saidnaya.
That's that infamous prison, right? Notorious for torture and human rights abuses.
Exactly. For a lot of Syrians, the fall of Assad offers a glimmer of hope, a chance to finally find some answers, some closure. But it also shows just how long and difficult the road to recovery will be. It's like a reminder that behind all the politics and power plays, there are real people whose lives have been shattered.
Absolutely, and the effects of this go way beyond Syria's borders. Let's talk about Russia. Putin put a ton of resources into propping up Assad for years. And this wasn't just about friendship, right? This was about maintaining a foothold in the Middle East, projecting power.
Exactly. Russia's military presence in Syria. Those bases they established were a symbol of their influence in the region. And now, with Assad gone, that influence is seriously diminished.
The Institute for the Study of War called it a strategic political defeat for Moscow. What does that actually mean for Russia, though?
It makes them look weak on the world stage. Putin has cultivated this image of strength, the savvy strategist. And now, he looks vulnerable. And this comes at a time when Russia is already facing immense pressure because of the war in Ukraine.
So it's not just a symbolic loss, this actually weakens their position in other conflicts.
It exposes their weaknesses. The fact that they couldn't save their ally, a regime they've been propping up for years, raises serious questions about their military, the strategic thinking, their ability to influence anything. It has real consequences for their ability to project power and achieve their objectives anywhere.
It's almost like a domino effect. The collapse in Syria ripples outwards, impacting power dynamics on a global scale. And this brings us to the war in Ukraine, a conflict that's been deeply intertwined with Russia's actions in Syria.
The fall of Assad has definitely given Ukraine and their supporters a boost there, pointing to this as proof that Russia isn't as invincible as Putin wants everyone to think.
So it's a psychological blow more than anything.
Exactly. It chips away at that narrative of Russian strength and competence that Putin has worked so hard to build. And it gives more fuel to those who say that continuing to support Ukraine can actually lead to real victories against Russia. You know,
Going through these sources, I keep seeing this theme that the situation in Syria has exposed the limits of Russian power. It's not just about military strength, it's about their ability to control what happens to maintain their influence.
That's a really important point. Putin's strategy in Syria was based on the idea that he could prop up Assad forever, that he could control the outcome. And now it's all falling apart. It raises serious questions about whether he can do the same thing in Ukraine.
We're seeing reports, for instance, from outlets like BBC News that Russia has had to scale back their operations in Ukraine, redeploying troops and equipment from the front lines to try and secure their remaining assets in Syria.
That's a major development. It suggests they don't have the resources to fight both conflicts at the same time. They're having to make choices, prioritize, and that weakens them in both places.
And it's not just about military resources, is it? The economic sanctions because of the war in Ukraine are hitting them hard too.
Oh, absolutely. Russia's economy is in trouble, and losing Syria as an ally just adds to that pressure. They've lost access to key markets, investments, partnerships. This makes it even harder for them to fund their military and maintain control over their sphere of influence.
So bringing it back to the Syrian people, what happens to them now that Assad is gone? We have reports of a new interim government forming, led by a guy named Mohammed al-Bashir.
And this is where things get really interesting. Okay, al-Bashir's background suggests strong ties to the Islamist groups that played a key role in the uprising against Assad, especially HTS. Some sources even call him a close associate of the Islamists, so
we could be looking at a more hardline religious government in Syria. What would that mean for the country, for the whole region?
It's a development with big implications. A shift toward Islamist rule in Syria could have ripple effects across the Middle East, affecting everything from regional alliances to fight against terrorism. World leaders, especially in the West, are watching this very closely. And of course, we can't talk about Syria without talking about Turkey. Erdogan has been making some pretty bold moves in the wake of Assad's fall.
He's definitely seizing the moment. We've seen reports from outlets like Sputnik News, which lean pro-Russia, talking about Russian officials practically begging Erdogan for safe passage out of their Syrian bases. Wow, that's a huge reversal of roles.
It really shows how fast the balance of power can shift. So what's Erdogan's endgame here? What's he trying to do?
He's playing the long game. He wants to solidify Turkey's position as a major power in the region, and the chaos in Syria gives him the perfect opportunity. He's already positioning himself as the key player in getting energy to Europe, potentially cutting Russia out completely.
So, cheaper gas and oil for European countries. But at the cost of making Erdogan more powerful, there are always trade-offs, aren't there?
Always. And it's not just about energy. Erdogan's been very vocal about his concerns over Kurdish groups in Syria, groups he sees as a threat to Turkey. The situation in Syria gives him more leverage to deal with those concerns, maybe through military action or political pressure.
So everyone's trying to take advantage of this power vacuum, all with their own agendas.
And then you have the wild card, the return of Donald Trump to the White House. His foreign policy is, well, let's just say it's unpredictable.
That's one way to put it. His return adds a whole new layer of uncertainty to an already volatile situation. Our sources, including Al Jazeera and BBC News, are reporting that Trump's already hinting at a possible shift in US policy toward Ukraine, saying he might be more open to negotiating with Putin, even if it means pushing Ukraine to give up something.
That set off alarm bells in Kiev. Zelensky is understandably worried about the US reducing their support. He's even said that the only way to guarantee Ukraine's safety is for unoccupied Ukraine to be brought under NATO protection.
That seems pretty unlikely though, right? Bringing Ukraine into NATO would be a huge escalation, potentially sparking a direct war with Russia.
It's definitely risky and something NATO members are hesitant to do, but it shows how desperate Kiev is as they face the possibility of a less supportive US administration.
So we have a situation that's changing fast on multiple fronts. A new and possibly Islamist government in Syria, a power vacuum everyone's trying to fill, a weakened Russia, an emboldened Ukraine, and a wild card in the form of Donald Trump. It's almost impossible to keep track of it all.
It is complex and fast-moving, but if we step back and look at the bigger picture, what we're seeing is a major shift in power, a change in the global order that's been sped up by what happened in Syria. Before we move on to the potential long-term consequences, I think it would be helpful to just go over the main points we've covered so far.
Agreed. A little recap would be good.
Okay, so starting with the timeline, we had the super fast collapse of the Assad regime in just 11 days, ending with him fleeing to Russia on December 8th. This was a huge military defeat for Assad, and a big strategic setback for his main supporter, Russia.
Then we talked about the human cost of this conflict. Millions of Syrians displaced, countless lives lost, and the ongoing struggle to find answers and closure.
And we talked about how the fall of Assad has given Ukraine hope, giving them a real example of Russian vulnerability and strengthening their arguments for continued Western support.
And of course, we can't forget the regional implications. We have a new government forming in Syria, possibly with Islamist leanings. Erdogan's taking advantage of the situation to increase Turkey's influence and secure his own interests. And looming over all of this is the unpredictable return of Donald Trump to the White House.
It feels like we're at this crossroads. So many different things could happen, so many unknowns. What are the experts saying about the long-term consequences of this whole thing?
Well, one thing that comes up a lot is the possibility of more instability in the region. The fall of Assad doesn't mean peace and prosperity for Syria. No, it could actually lead to a whole new era of conflict, especially with so many groups fighting for power.
And a destabilized Syria could impact the whole Middle East, couldn't it? We've already seen how it's affected Russia's position and emboldened Turkey.
Exactly. A weakened Syria could become a breeding ground for extremism, a place for foreign interference, a source of tension in the region. It's a scenario that a lot of world leaders are really worried about.
And what about the Syrian people after going through a decade of civil war? What are their chances of rebuilding their lives and their country?
It's a huge task. Millions are displaced. Infrastructure is destroyed. The economy is in ruins. Rebuilding Syria will take a massive international effort, a commitment to peace and reconciliation, and a willingness to deal with the root causes of the conflict. And that's only if they can even achieve some kind of stability.
What about Russia? We've talked about the immediate hits to their image and influence, but what are the long-term consequences of this loss?
For them, losing Syria weakens Russia's position in the Middle East big time. It hurts their reputation as a reliable ally, and it makes people question their ability to actually project power. This could make it harder for them to achieve their goals in the region, whether it's securing access to those warm water ports, expanding their military presence, or pushing back against Western influence.
And it probably makes their rivals bolder, right? Countries that have been wary of Russia getting more assertive might see this as a chance to challenge them.
Absolutely. Looking weak can be just as bad as actually being weak. And this comes at a time when Russia is already facing problems on multiple fronts, from the economic sanctions to the war in Ukraine.
And speaking of Ukraine, we can't forget about how all of this might affect that conflict. We've seen how the fall of Assad has given Ukraine a boost, but could it also help them make real gains on the battlefield?
It's possible if Russia has to take resources away from Ukraine to deal with the situation in Syria. It could give Ukrainian forces a chance to move forward, to take back some of the territory they lost. And even if they don't move troops around, the perception that Russia's weak could encourage Ukraine to take more risks, to launch bolder attacks.
And of course, there's the big question mark of the US with Donald Trump back in charge. His unpredictability makes it hard to know what role he'll play in Syria, in Ukraine, and in the whole region.
True. His past comments suggest he might be more on Putin's side, more willing to make a deal, even if it means Ukraine loses out. And this has obviously made Kiev very nervous.
So we have a lot going on here. A changed geopolitical landscape, a struggling Syria, a weakened Russia, an emboldened Ukraine, and an unpredictable US. What does this all mean for our listeners who are trying to understand this incredibly complicated situation?
I think the main takeaway is that we're in a time of huge uncertainty and change. The old rules don't apply anymore, and the balance of power is shifting in ways we can't predict. What happened in Syria shows us that even regimes that seem really strong can fall apart, that the geopolitical landscape can change fast, and that the consequences of those changes can be felt all over the world.
It also reminds us about the human cost of these conflicts. The Syrian people, the Ukrainians, so many others caught in the middle, they are the ones who suffer the most. It's easy to get caught up in the big political game, but we can't forget about the human stories at the heart of it all.
Absolutely. And as we move forward into this uncertain future, it's important to keep those human stories in mind, to make peace and diplomacy a priority, and to work towards a world where these kinds of conflicts are less likely to happen.
Well, we've covered a lot in this core insight. We looked at the reasons for the fall of the Assad regime, what it means for Russia and the war in Ukraine, and the potential for more instability and change in the region. Things are changing fast, the stakes are high, and the future is uncertain.
But one thing's for sure, the world is watching. And what's happening in Syria will have a huge impact on the global order for years to come.
Thank you for joining us on this Core Insight. Keep exploring, stay curious, and we'll see you on the next one.